Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my week 10 video. And today I'm going to be talking with you about two important topics considering external form in this week's readings and 8 concrete steps that you can actually use to respond to a poem, and that will be very helpful to you in paper 2. So if you want to follow along, the first document is found if you go up to content toward the top of our page, then to course documents, and then look for that external form in poetry. So we've talked about internal form or structure, and now we're thinking about external form or structure in a poem. We know that tone, speaker, situation setting, the theme, the diction, the imagery used, the sound when the poem is read, the rhythm, just the general arrangement of the wording is called internal structure in poetry. But the external form of a poem, though, relates to its overall arrangement on the page and into visual units. So how it visually looks is a big part of external form. So here are some different kinds of external form that you'll find in poetry. There are traditional or fixed stanza forms like the sonnet, and we've talked about this before, either the Italian, also called the Petrarchan sonnet, or the Shakespearean, also called the English sonnet. And we know that a sonnet consists of 14 lines of iambic pentameter. So if you're ever asked that on a quiz or on an exam, remember the rule there. Terza rima, that's a type of external form where the first and third lines of each stanza will rhyme. So remember, a stanza is a group of lines together. Then there'll be a space, then another stanza, right? So the first and third lines of every stanza will rhyme in the terza rima. The middle line will then rhyme with the first and third lines of the next stanza. And it's really difficult to set out to write a terza rima, around that rather complicated form. A Spenserian stanza is a form named for Edmund Spenser in which the only 3 rhyme sounds are used in 9 rhymed lines. So only 3 sounds that rhyme are used in 9 rhymed lines. The ballad stanza, only 1 set of rhymes is found in 4 lines. Lines 1 and 3 do not rhyme. Lines 2 and 4 are rhymed iambic trimesters, so 3 beats in a foot. And then you probably heard of haiku. That's an unrhymed Japanese poetic form, and it consists usually of 17 syllables arranged in 3 lines containing 5, 7, and 5 syllables respectively. A haiku will express a lot in just a little bit of wording, so it's a very difficult form to write well in. And then a limerick, that's sort of a humorous verse of 5 lines in which the first, second, and fifth line will rhyme with each other, and the third and fourth lines, which are usually shorter, will form a rhymed couplet. A villanelle is a short poem of fixed form written in tercets, usually 5 in number, followed by a final quatrain, all being based on 2 rhymes. And then a palindrome is a word, verse, or sentence such as "Able was I ere I saw Elba," or a number like 1881 that reads the same backward or forward. So kind of interesting. A sestina is a poem of 6 6-line stanzas and a 3-line envoy, originally without rhyme, in which each stanza repeats the end words of the lines of the first stanza, but in a different order. The envoy using the 6 words again, 3 in the middle of the lines and 3 at the end. So in graduate school, in our poetry writing classes, we had to write a sestina, we had to write a villanelle and a palindrome, and all of these different forms, and it's really rather challenging to do that. Now, I will never ask you to know the definitions of all of these different kinds of traditional or fixed forms beyond that of the sonnet in a quiz or an exam, but you do need to have a familiarity with them, and that's why we're talking about them this week. Now, there are non-traditional external forms, and these are really cool. So there's a form called a concrete poem, And that's a poem composed in a specific shape on the page so that it looks like some object. So when you look at the poem on the page, the shape of it resembles something. And you'll see an example of that in one of this week's readings. Visual poems, though they don't resemble any specific shape, may depend somehow on their visual form to help establish meaning. So, for example, there might be a big space, bigger than normal, between one stanza and the next to sort of establish this sense of silence or pause or something like that. Poems can be a combination, sort of hybrids of various forms, and you'll see that in this week's exercises. So when you first look at a poem on the page, you might notice that its external form looks different, almost as if, again, the words are designed on purpose to form a shape. Well, if that's the case, it's probably a concrete poem. But alternatively, you might notice the poem possesses a very traditional external form with a specified sort of number of rhymes and lines and things like that. So it might be a sonnet, a terza rima, a sestina. And sometimes you might have even noticed a poet will make an effort to defy a traditional form by reworking it to fit his or her own ideas. So sometimes that's kind of interesting to look at too. So here are some questions to ask yourself as you're considering external form. Is the poem divided into traditional stanzas, so those groupings of lines, or is there unusual spacing in the poem? If so, it may be a visual poem or a concrete poem. Does the poem rhyme or is it free verse? If it rhymes, it's going to be some kind of a traditional form. If it doesn't, then it's a non-traditional form. Is the poem written in a traditional or fixed form? Is it a concrete poem? How do the choices affect you as a reader? So remember, external form gives you yet something else to write about in paper too. You can write about setting. You can write about internal form. You can write about external form. All these things that we're looking at each week will be helpful to you in writing your paper. So now let's think about those 8 concrete steps. And that actually is not found in documents, but rather in the discussion board postings. So, you might want to go to the Week 10 board and look for that second topic, which is using the 8 steps to respond to a poem. But I want to take a moment to go over it with you and to clarify what I want you to do in that second topic of the board this week. So after reading your group's assigned poem, because I'm dividing you up into groups, as you'll see, and each group will have a poem that they're looking at, you would follow the 8 steps below to explicate the poem's deeper themes and meanings. And after following the steps, then you would upload your individual response to the 8 steps. So, you don't have to respond to a classmate in this discussion topic, but it might be nice to look at other people's responses to see their thoughts. And notice that this is an awesome exercise to complete for the poem you are writing about in paper too, because every single step gives you, again, material to write about in your paper. So step 1, and this is true of any type of creative writing that you're looking at, look at the title and the first line or two. Because remember, the title is the very first way that the author has to communicate with you, the reader, and to sort of get your mind in a certain zone to be thinking about what the poet wants you to be thinking about as you approach that piece of writing. So look at the poem's title and look at the first line or two. What are your expectations? What connotations do the words in the title and the first line bring to mind? So what automatic associations are you making with the title Barbie doll, or whatever the title of the poem may be? And this gives you something you can write about and quote from in your paper. So remember, sometimes poets will use false leads. They might try to surprise you with a hook of some sort at the beginning, but don't let that throw you off. And as you continue to read, pay attention to what you expect and when, where and how the poem is either fulfilling those expectations or denying them. So sometimes you'll have a title like My Papa's Waltz, and you'll think, oh, this is going to be a sweet little poem about You know, a little girl stepping up on her dad's shoes and waltzing with him and having a wonderful time, or going to a dance and dancing with her daddy. No. It turns out that this is a poem about a little boy whose father is an alcoholic, and the waltz is actually symbolism for the abuse that the child suffers when the alcoholic father comes home and tosses him around the room. So there's a false lead for sure that defies your expectation. Step 2, read the syntax, and that's a word that means the order of the words. So read it, literally, read it out loud to yourself, and see if you can identify sentences or phrases, ignoring the line breaks again. Because remember, a thought or a sentence may not end where the line ends. It may continue on into the next line, and the next even. So try to figure out, where does a sentence begin and where does it end? And see if you can pick out maybe a subject, verb, maybe an object if there is one, of each sentence or phrase. That will help you see, here's where a sentence is ending or thought is ending and a new one is beginning. Or this is just all one long sentence in this poem. If the poem is an older work or a work that makes use of extremely formal language, try to translate those sentences into more modern language so that you can access meaning. So if you've got, say a poem written by Shakespeare, see if you can figure out, if I were going to say this in today's modern language, how would I say this same thing? How would I articulate this main thought? And that will help you to understand what's happening in the poem. Now note that when you do the discussion board topic for this exercise, you do not actually have to sit down and list the subjects and verbs and objects of every single sentence in your poem that your group is looking at. But rather, if you just want to take one line, and use that as an example, that's fine. But this step is one that you can and should do on your own when you're looking at the poem you're going to write about for paper 2, because it will really help you to understand the poem. Step 3, use your dictionary, whether it's an online dictionary or a hard copy dictionary. Use a reference book or websites to look up things you do not understand, because you're not going to understand the poem if you don't take the step, all right? A lot of you are like, I'm not going to do that. Well, you may miss the whole meaning of the poem if you don't do that. So look up historical references that you're not familiar with. Look up an unfamiliar word where you don't know the meaning of the word. Maybe it's an idea from mythology. Maybe it's a place with which you're unfamiliar. Look that up. Take the time to do that, because that could be the difference between an A and a D. And next, think about the connotations of the words or phrases. So again, not the literal dictionary meaning, the denotative meaning, but the connotative meaning, all the associations that we're making with words. So I'm wearing green. What do you think about when you hear the word green, right? So that kind of thing, that's connotative meaning. And then step 4, ask the who, what, when, where, how, and why questions. Who is the speaker or speakers? Maybe there's more than one. Who is the audience? What characters appear in the poem? Where is the speaker? When and where are these events happening that he or she describes? When in history? Where in the nation or the world? What is the situation that's being described? What literally happens? If the poem doesn't tell a story, then how is it structured? Is it lyrical? Is it all about feelings? Does the subject or focus shift at some point in the course of the poem? When and how? All of that material gives you material to write about in paper 2. Step 5, formulate tentative answers to each of the questions above in an effort to put it all together to understand why it matters and what it means. So ask yourself, why should this topic matter to anyone other than the poet? So what is it about this poem that might relate to most everyone? What problems or issues or questions or conflicts in that poem might be relevant or universal to most people? How is each problem or conflict approached and resolved within the poem? Now, it may not be resolved. In Barbie Doll, things really aren't resolved, right? The girl kills herself, whether figuratively or literally, however you choose to interpret that. And you could interpret it either way. So it isn't really resolved. It's really a tragedy. What conclusions does the poem seem to reach? And then step 6, consider how the poem's form, so internal and external, contributes to the effect and meaning of the poem. So how is this poem put together? What are its formal features? How do the poem's overall form and structure contribute to meaning? So is it utilizing rhyme? Is it a traditional form or a non-traditional? Is it utilizing techniques like metaphor and simile, symbolism, alliteration, meter? So in other words, what's getting lost if you try to translate the poem's language into just modern prose? What gets lost? Step 7, how does this poem draw on or depart from poetic tradition, especially in terms of its formal features? So is it conforming to a set pattern like a sonnet, a ballad, a villanelle, etc.? Does it contain rhyme, or is it seeming to break away from those traditional forms? And maybe the subject matter or the theme of the poem is about breaking away from something. And so that breaking away from tradition with poetic form kind of mirrors the theme. And then finally, the last step, argue. And I don't mean in a mean way, but just discuss the poem with someone else. You might read it to a friend or a family member at home to see if your interpretations line up with that other person's, and learn how that other person's analysis might differ dramatically from yours, because that might make you think, I hadn't looked at it that way before. Let me think about this. There's no need to actually write about step 8 in your response, to that topic in the discussion board, but do try to glean an understanding of someone else's interpretation of your assigned poem, whether it's someone in your group and you go back and read what they wrote, or whether you actually share the poem with maybe a friend or a family member to get their thoughts. So thanks for tuning in, and have a great day, and I will see you next time around.